So Public Works was initially part of a larger organization called Demos in New York City, kind of a nonprofit kind of organization, works on a lot of different progressive kind of goals and issues. It grew out of some conversations with a longtime friend and program officer at the Ford Foundation, Michael Lipsky, and our president of Public Works, Diane Stewart, and myself and some others, where Michael really thought that all the things he had funded in a whole array of social policy work and civic engagement work around the country was in some ways fundamentally thwarted by the underlying negative attitudes toward government and the decline in faith and trust over the last 30 years. And so he's like, maybe we should take that on directly. So he gave a small grant to Diane and the initial team at Public Works just to begin exploring, like, how would one even begin to kind of tackle this problem, and held a series of conversations around the country with kind of key stakeholders and people who have been thinking about this, and from advocates to public manager, kind of an array of people in various communities. That led us to a relationship with the Frameworks Institute initially, and then their core research team, which became Topos Partnership, and that we've now worked with for 8 years. And so we really did feel like we needed to get deeper than standard kind of polling and public opinion research, and really use the kind of framing and cognitive science and linguistic approach to understanding what was going on, and also some kind of cultural and psychological approaches that the Topos team brings to that question. So starting in about 2004, we launched on a series of research efforts. The first step was really this kind of fundamental, like, how do people think and reason about government, and what are the openings for creating a more productive conversation? A second set of research that lasted almost 3 years into how people understand how the economy works, and in particular government's role in the economy. And then separate, smaller research efforts on budgets and taxes. A lot of our work in the field over the last few years has been with organizations trying to make the case for adequate revenues for public services. And so the budget and tax work has been really important. I'll talk some more about some of these odds and ends and the methodology in a minute, but prior to, I joined the team in 2004 as the research was just beginning, and we were beginning to think about a field kind of role. What are we going to do with it? Diane and I had worked together for almost 15 years at the Center for Public Policy Priorities in Texas, which was kind of one of the network of progressive kind of think tank groups fundamentally doing fiscal policy work, so part of the State Fiscal Analysis Initiative, if people are familiar with that around the country. We also had the Kids Count project, so we were doing child well-being research and data, and economic analysis, and so we were kind of the kind of core think tank in Texas. And so trying to make the case for anti-poverty policy and tax policy in Texas is kind of a really good learning ground for, like, how you need to navigate this difficult terrain. And so I was excited to join that work, and then to think about how we took it out to the country. Our almost natural networks initially were those people we had professional relationships with from 15 years of work in the state fiscal groups, in the kind of child well-being and child policy groups, and the kind of progressive economic analysis groups. So those became kind of the first people we began to work with, and then that grew, and I'll talk a little bit about the field work in a few minutes. So we have been really doing this actively in the field since 2005, 2006, and have been in 35 states one way or another, thousands of people in various iterations. I'll talk a little bit about the ways that happens in a minute. So we have this minor mission, right? Building support for government again that we're tackling. We're not, just a small task that we've undertaken. Oh, I didn't mention also, we spun off as our own separate nonprofit, keeping our program name as our organizational name, Public Works, in April of last year. So we're a standalone C3 team of 6 people, so it's taking on this big task. We're all kind of virtual. Most of the team is in or near Austin, Texas, with one staff person in North Carolina. And we have a little co-working space we use part-time in Austin. And so I mentioned the research in the field. It has been almost anybody who thinks that kind of public attitudes toward government is a problem for their work. So all the kind of policy organizations, think tanks, advocates, coalitions working on revenue issues, more in the last few years with community organizers and really kind of more grassroots kind of groups. In fits and starts, kind of public elected officials and public managers, we are kind of studiously nonpartisan in our kind of field work about this. That said, the people who care about government tend to be more progressive or Democratic legislators on the elected side, and so we do get invited in to do that. We are not seeking a political audience necessarily, but we've been asked to come, and we've now done 2 sessions with the Senate Democratic Caucus in California. Just like come in and spend one-on-one time with them. And when we get those invitations, we're happy to take them, but it's not a we do not take kind of a political perspective on it. Public managers, on the other hand, a very interesting audience for us. More work with kind of local leagues of cities who are trying to do some innovative work about how they engage constituents, how they just kind of help people understand how you run a city and what it takes. Some great work being done in Minnesota and some other places on some kind of thinking about how they communicate the work of government and engage people differently. International County Managers Association, some key players in there and their kind of civic engagement teams that do some work there also are an audience for this work. A lot of work over the years with public sector unions, naturally trying to think about how they talk about the work of public workers. Pretty intensive work in the first few years with AFSCME and AFT in particular, so much so that we ran at AFSCME's 2007 convention, we ran 21 separate consecutive sector caucuses with 1,700 workers. So each caucus was designed to help like EMT workers think about how they apply these ideas to talking about emergency services, to public health workers. They were short sessions, but to get in front of 1,700 union leaders in one morning was quite a feat. It was like, I really appreciated the infrastructure of some of those big organizations at that point. The presentations in the field are an array of things. So sometimes you just get invited to do this, come and do a lunch, speak, and you have 30 minutes, and we do that, or workshops and conferences, the hour and a half kind of thing. We tend to like the longer term engagements, which range from half-day trainings, which get in a little bit deeper, to full day or full day and a half boot camps, kind of intensive, 50 people walking through. Kind of fundamentals of the kind of theoretical underpinnings, kind of the framing and cognitive science of this kind of communication, then the kind of core content, then practice. In Oregon, thanks to our partnership with Larry and Larry Wallach and Neighborhood Partnerships up there, have now done 3 advocates colleges, which are essentially a cohort of 20 to 25 people over a period of 6 to 8 months in 4 to 6 separate sessions. So you really get to map it out as a curriculum that's all geared toward ending up with them being able to apply it in whatever work they're actually doing on the ground, whether they're a legislative advocate or a public manager or whoever they are. The audiences have been mixed or organizing, and they're practicing. They're like integrating, they have homework, they're reading, and then trying to integrate this into real practice. And then from those colleges and a few other places, we've identified key practitioners or people who just really get this, and this is exactly the way they want to approach their work. And we've created a small fellows group, and we're beginning to do some train the trainer kind of work with this as well. Follow-up consultation is always important to us, so that particularly we have these longer term relationships, okay, help people then continue to apply this stuff in a consistent way. Op-ed, speeches, legislative advocacy, website materials, how they organize an event, like whatever they're doing, when we try to provide that kind of backup to get them to integrate it as much as they can. So a quick map of where we've been. Some engagement is, can be just as simple as like a simple conference workshop or a few different presentations. Moderate tends to be multiple trips over a few years. Intensive is where we've really dug in pretty deep and done pretty large cohort of people in those states over a period of multiple sessions and multiple years. Some caveats for most rooms I'm in are important. We are not trying to get people to like government as it is, and not making excuses for it, and not really arguing about big or small or those kinds of things. But our fundamental goal is just to get more of the public and even advocates to make this case. What is the unique role of government in a functioning society? And even if it's not functioning, how do you engage people in some sort of aspirational conversation about how it could and should work, and do that constructively? Michael Lipsky, the program officer, likes to say, if progressives have been against government in practice and conservatives against it in theory, then it's kind of no wonder where we are at the moment. So a lot of this work is, I think, from my mind, is getting a lot of audience to break bad habits about how they even relate to and talk about government, though they are theoretically the ones who like these public systems. We often spend some time in workshops. They're just trying to unpack kind of the trends over time. Where are we in basic questions about trust and government? This Pew's been tracking this, so I'm just giving you a flavor of some of the things we spend time on, so I'm not going to unpack this. People have really talked a lot about how this decline in faith and trust mirrors other kinds of social changes and cultural changes and trust in institutions, and you can mark where these changes are. One of the challenges with this survey work, and why I think it's so important to dig into these questions the way we have, this tends to conflate, as you'll see in a minute, politics with government. So that people's attitudes about Congress get overlaid on their attitudes about how the federal government operates, and that conflation is one of the things I'll talk about in a minute. So we were, using the methodology that we did in the team, trying to figure out what's the hidden reasoning behind those kinds of poll results, not just kind of reiterating those. So we spend some time thinking about and working with groups like, hey, so what do we think about government? That's pretty easy to find on the internet almost instantly. There's a million of these kinds of things, right? The team that we worked with, again, the folks at Topos in particular, Joe Grady, NXL, Albram, and Meg Bostrom, often begin their work with basic kind of ethnographic work, just kind of going out into the field and interviewing 300 people, 400 people in various locations and asking big open-ended questions about whatever topic they're on. And in this case, what do you think of government, as you'll see in a minute. And then their first step is to create what they call cognitive maps. Okay, where are people always going when you ask an open-ended question like that? What's almost literally, what's the first image? The images that pop into people's heads that you're getting back from that. So I'll show you a little set of those clips.
What do you think of the government?
Oh my gosh!
What do you think of the government? What do you think about the government? What do you think of the government?
Employees.
Is there one?
What do you think of the government?
It needs improvement.
It is what it is, man.
It's pretty pathetic.
I feel pretty helpless. I think there's a lot we don't know.
I've never voted a day in my life.
I stay out of the politics. I do my job, collect my paycheck, and stay out of the mess.
I will have to say that I remember Joe showing us these clips raw, lots more of them, and he's like, this might be a bigger problem than we thought. Like, universal cynical laughter is not usually where we start. But, and they had conversations with these people further, but really trying to understand why is that so universally this first kind of discomfort, even if you turn on the sound off, the body language is uncomfortable, and where do people go with that? And so a few things emerged pretty quickly in those conversations. And then there were discourse sessions, then there were focus groups, and there's like the whole methodology really was trying to unpack this, but those clips are a good illustration. One of the first things that it's important for us to remind a lot of the audience we're in front of is how little most people think about government. They are not grappling with it as a top-of-mind topic on a day-to-day basis. Busy with their lives, doing their job. It just pops up on the screen on the news or in some local thing that they pay attention to. So really actually grappling in any kind of in-depth way about what government's doing, what its job, how is it functioning, is way buried. And so just for a lot of the policy audiences, just helping people remember, you're thinking about it 1,000 times more than the people you're trying to communicate with. So there's some fundamental gaps in that right at the start. The first image that pops into people's minds is really this one of just politics. A sense that it is just a political spectator sport, and we'll unpack that in just a minute. But it's clearly this very vivid, very energized, partisan fight that people don't like. Like, I stay out of the fight. You saw that even in the language in one of those clips. The second, kind of right behind that, is another image that is blurry. It's like some big bureaucracy. I don't know what it does, but I do know it wants my money. So you have this combination of the two top-of-mind images really of a very vivid kind of fight image and this political image, and or this giant monolithic bureaucracy. I can't describe it to you. I can't even come close to estimating how many people work for it, what it does, etc. And then thirdly, what emerged in the deeper conversations with people is a sense that people have come to view government as a vending machine. So the relationship to government is a transactional one. So, and that has all kinds of problems, and I'll unpack that a little bit more in just a second. So those are the three hurdles, but we were also trying to find openings. What were the cracks through those? And a few things emerged that were heartening at some level. One is that the idea of government's not totally lost. I joked about Joe wondering if it had been, after he saw the initial interviews. But a little bit, not far beneath the surface, people can still articulate, why do you have government? At some pretty philosophical level, and we'll quote founding document language, and it's much more available to them than we thought. Some sort of philosophical underpinning of why government exists, what it should do. They're cynical that that's actually how it operates, right? But that's not gone entirely, and that's a big opening. People want to feel like their role as a citizen in the society is valued, and they want to feel like they have some agency. They don't know what to do with that, but there is a citizen instinct out there, kind of the old-fashioned version of that word, not the green card version, right? And again, frustrated and often feel like it's thwarted by the way government actually interacts with them, but again, huge potential for people that kind of civic sense to be reignited. There's our pragmatism. Can't we just figure out how to solve some stuff? Shouldn't we collectively be able to come up with solutions to things? And again, even that desire for respecting consensus, that desire for problem solving is a big opening to step into in an important way. There is a lot of blurriness between what is the private sector's role and the public sector's role. And right here in the Bay Area, like the left-leaning focus group, 9 people cannot collectively decide with some consensus whether or not BART was a public entity. So there's this real fuzziness, sure, there are lots of contracting, there are privatization things that confuse it, but they just couldn't fundamentally remember whether or not it was. And this is like the D's, and like everywhere you ride, and it says for more information, see BART.gov, right? So relatively straightforward, maybe. But what we uncovered in the conversations is that it's real hard for people to articulate the unique kind of function and purpose and responsibility of the public sector versus the private sector, that it has become blurred. But there is one sector in which that remains kind of clear for them, and that's a sense of planning for the future, kind of stewardship over time. They do not give that set of responsibilities to business and the private sector. So it's another big opening, this sense that somebody is responsible, whether or not they're doing it well, a separate set of questions, right? For planning and thinking about where we are going 5, 10, 15, 50 years from now, and that is fundamentally a public role. It is not a private role. So those 3 kind of hurdles, then we begin to unpack this with people, and you're just getting the kind of the overview of a short presentation. So this is a sculpture by a friend of mine, which is my undergrad's at BFA in sculpture, so I sneak in art in my presentations, which I love this sculpture, they're bipartisan. And so it is a sense that it is just this spectator sport. So lots of things are problematic with that. One, it's a fight. I only pay attention to kind of how my team's doing, right? Or when I vote, essentially, it means I don't really have a role other than making that decision on election day, and then I just watch, right? And so it is a very distancing kind of first image that people have about that. The antidote to that really is that first, that opening I talked about. What is the unique mission and purpose of government, and can you engage people in that conversation? And it really takes it out of a political realm and back into almost the underpinning reasons why you create government in the first place. And out of those conversations were some really deeply held values and ideas that people would talk about: common good and public purpose and quality of life and community well-being. These are the big reasons why you need to have a government that functions well and does its public interest focused work. And so that's those kind of level 1 values, to use Lakoff's kind of terminology, are the entry point to get them to remember, okay, if that's what it's for, how do we make it work that way? How do we engage them? So it begins to push back the superficial sense that it's just about politics, if you will. Roles that people were able to think about more quickly. I talked about manager and planner and steward and those kinds of things. The government's unique role as protector was closer to the surface than a lot of other ones that are blurry for them. So clean water, safe food, regulations are more quickly come out of a conversation as things I can't do myself, and why you create public systems to do them. And so in some policy realms, public health in particular, that value, that kind of particular role is there and present and able to, I think, and I'll be curious about your experience with this, Lori, but easier to kind of help people remember that than some others. I wanted to give one example from field work about how people really shifted to use these kinds of unique, in general, on the communications and framing side, better values-based language, but also in the service of a debate about public revenues. So in Texans Care for Children and their coalition, $27 billion shortfall, in a very problematic session, they were really struggling because, as you might know, the standard laundry list of terrible things that are going to be cut only had so much traction, and it's one of the things we try to move people away from. But they were trying to reclaim a story about Texas, and in trainings we did with them, could you tap into some of these larger values of the reason why you fund these public systems and how they're connected to the people, how people view their state, and to do that in a very explicit and direct way. And so they began to do some work on that. They had several great videos. They wanted to, again, reclaim kind of a narrative about the state. And I'll send a link to this later because it's a great little little video clip that they ran mostly on the internet. So we did a bunch of work with them. They have great practitioners. They did a Wordle of some of their standard revenue documents, which looked like this in the before version and this afterwards. So Texans, they say Texas about every other sentence in the video, right? It's just like this reclaiming a story of what makes Texas proud. They have this whole story of, we put people on the moon, we had Lady Bird Johnson. I mean, just like re-owning a story of the state, and that is what's at stake, right? Not this laundry list of particular services people may have no idea what it's about. And then they had the details and analysis to go with it. But this was just a complete transformation to pay attention to how you make the case through a values lens about the kind of public services they wanted to protect. That second image, kind of this mindless bureaucracy, people really have a really hard time articulating in any meaningful way what does government do. I mean, it's like you have to pull teeth out of them. They're like, oh yeah, right, I drove here on a road. I mean, something as simple as that, right? It just does not come quickly, and they just see it as the kind of superficial stereotype, it's a big bureaucracy, is just where it gets stuck, and it's really hard to push through that. So this is fundamentally kind of a systems thinking challenge. How do you help people see and remember the public systems and the public structures that are all around them and why they're important? And how do you do that quickly? Like, how do you get that to be an image that pops up for them more quickly than these other stereotypes? And this is where, again, working with the folks at Topos was so interesting, because they went back out into the field to try and just begin to experiment with other ways to talk about the work of government that almost literally put a different image in their heads more quickly than the problematic ones that we have. So can you create those images? Can it quickly convey a sense of the public systems we created and why they're important and how they work? So they zoned in on test language like this, and it was for those of you who may know this terminology, that what they call a simplifying model, kind of almost using a metaphor as a tool to distill an image they're trying to get across. And they tested lots of different kind of candidate texts. This became a test that they did. I'll show some video clips in a minute, but I'll just let you read it. I'm talking over my own slide. So its goal is to get across one core idea, essentially, that the public systems we have built over time are essential to our functioning and our prosperity, whatever the kind of others is. Examples are important, so depending on what the field you work in, kind of helping that be more present is important. So they tested this in an interesting way. That is a methodology that's used in some of this field, and that Topos has used quite a bit in different versions of what they call talkback testing. Some of it is just cold on the street. Walk up, can I read this paragraph to you, and ask you to repeat back to me as many of the core ideas as you can remember, and then ask some questions about it. They also do a version more in a test setting where they have two people in a room, and they come in and they literally read a text like this test, and then leave. Have two new people come in the room and have the first pair try to articulate to the second pair what they just heard, second to third, third to fourth, fourth to fifth, and they're literally watching behind the window to see how it holds together. Because as you know, you can't memorize this, like the kids' game telephone. Like, you can't pass it along unless it's tapping into a way of thinking about the question that's already there, even if latent, right? And so what they're truly trying to find is those cues, that if communicated well, can essentially ignite the right construct of thinking that then can be passed along. Because literally, if you're trying to change, this is a culture change challenge, right? Can you find some levers for passing these ideas into a culture by using communications as a tool to do that? So this test language ended up passing that test, literally. So it lasted 6 or 7 generations that's a very high bar. It didn't always sound exactly the same, but the core idea held together, right? And they may have used different language, and in many cases added their own knowledge in, which is even better. They bring their own examples in, right? They're kind of riffing on the core idea and getting it across. So I'll show some clips. Most of these are on the street, so just literally, can I read you something, and then you would just repeat back what did that mean? What did it stick to you? And then a couple other questions. Can you name some public systems? Can you tell me why they're important, et cetera? There's a couple of places more in the room setting I talked about. There are labels on some of the clips that are people's self-professed liberal, conservative, independent. So that's not us labeling the answer, but it's informative to look at differences or not differences in those clips.
Government can do things that individuals can't do.
You really need the internal structure to make everything work and for people to prosper.
I think you need them for civilization that works.
Things that help everyday life keep going.
An organized way of getting things done in America.
I guess an organized way to connect people so that people can communicate with each other, reach each other physically and just idea-wise.
It's the things that make our economy work.
They support the community. They support, it's for the common good.
America, one of the reasons it's able to be functional and successful on many different levels like it is because of public structures. Highways are public structures that enable business persons from, factories to deliver goods to merchants, like an institution like the system of law, or the social service system, which would help people to get food, help justice to be done, which kind of enables society to flow. So the public structures could be something physical or something, institutional.
They can put more money into education. Would that be a public structure? Sure. Yeah, if they put more money into education and things like that, I think that would be more beneficial. And healthcare.
How about the FCC regulations on how cell phones work? You wouldn't be able to have that thing if they didn't have that. It would be wild. A public structure? Oh, sure it is. It's part of the organizational structure. We have an FCC and we have rules.
That's different.
When he says structures, you mean strictly steel girdered buildings?
I guess I do.
Oh, okay.
Well,
so you don't think the FCC helps you? Your cellular phone would be impossible without it. There'd be a hodgepodge of electromagnetic radiation all over the place.
It is anyway.
No, it's not. It's very organized.
Public structures are civilization.
Stuff to build a better society.
To improve quality of life.
So then there can be like a system, you have to have a system. And without the system, it'll just be like different people doing nothing,
Basically, it's where people could get together and discuss issues that need to be taken care of. Sort of like a town hall type deal.
There's certain things the government does better than private hands could do. I mean, I can't imagine the airline industry if it wasn't regulated. I mean, who'd want to fly if you couldn't be sure, that all the planes were being kept up properly and somebody was keeping track of that. And I just don't think you can count on an industry to do that.
We also did a big priming survey to test whether or not how these things moved and changed answers to a battery of policy questions. And it was quite stunning how consistent the hurdles are across people's professed ideology, and how the openings were almost identical as well. Like, you really could move people to this kind of conversation. Now you're still gonna have to have a debate about, okay, how do we pay for it? And, the details become the debate, but at least this is the right terrain to have that debate on versus the stereotypes that you saw at the beginning, right? So there's almost no difference in the kind of self-professed ideology. Anything else?
I couldn't help but think of when these were being, what was the sort of political context at the time, what was the dialogue and discourse going on, and whether they would be influenced by that.
Somewhat, the initial work really was done pretty early, like 2006, and then it was retested again in 2009. The economy work bridged from 2008 past the meltdown, and I'll show a couple things about that. The priming survey was a little bit later. We've done some kind of retest just to make sure. I think the thing that's been very useful for taking the approach we did with methodology is that these are deeply embedded kind of cultural challenges and openings. And so they have stood a lot of the cycles in relatively consistent ways. The openings change. Openings or the barriers change a little bit given the context. And that's been where the field work has been, where we've experimented. So doing this work in Washington is real different than doing it in Nebraska, right? But the fundamental ideas begin to, I think, still, from our work in the field, seem to still be the right kind of way to engage it. Then you have to kind of grapple with what is the context and what are the openings to do it. What are they not talking about in the second clips? Right, the politics is gone. So you think about the top of mind image is this conflation of government just with this political noise. These people, it's gone entirely, right? And so they really are able to then really focus the conversation on how do you run things? What does it take? What are the public, and that kind of pragmatism and that kind of opening for a conversation that's separate from the political one was really kind of remarkable how you could get that to happen, and how just by kind of priming this in some important ways and not triggering it just to be politics can keep you in that terrain in an interesting way. You'll notice that the text does not say government directly at all, and yet even in these clips, two people say government right back to the interviewer. So you're not tricking anybody, right? But this becomes, again, in the kind of framing, kind of theory, an order issue. If you say, hey, let me talk to you about a government program, you're pretty much done, right? Because the top of mind images are what you saw. But if you can engage them first on kind of, okay, let me tell you about this kind of public purpose we're trying to, whatever it is, through a values lens, through some of these tools, you've opened the door to a different kind of room. And then people will say to you, oh yeah, well that's a role that government should play. And so we're not trying to avoid talking about government, but this really is an order challenge. And we have to be careful in my work with advocates, like what are you triggering for us when you're trying to engage them in questions about public services. We're also never telling people they have to memorize this paragraph and always use it verbatim, or even use the model terminology itself, public structures, although there are really useful things about it, but getting that core idea across, I think is the main thing. I think in doing the work and just kind of doing my own reading on that kind of model work, the term brings some strength to it, so we do try to get people to play with it when they can, because structures itself is useful. Because I do this in workshops, like, so why is structure a useful term? How do they happen? They always are built. They don't just happen. So there's coming with this description of government is an intentionality and the need for stewardship and maintenance. I mean, those kind of come with the model, right? Which again helps you broaden the time horizon. There's all kinds of things that are useful about this concept if you can find a way to embed it in the work. So a little graphic, that folks at Topos did for us. So the first clips really exist on that left side, just the political arrangement. We elect, they go off and forget about us. When you can round it out, the whole conversation changes. Now, because those people essentially are our temporarily hired managers. What endures, right, for good or how they're doing, are our public systems, which we yield benefits from. Therefore, it also resets a little bit of our collective responsibility, right? So then, what's our role as citizens to maintain these things over time? Which is another set of conversations that's really useful. I'm just going to briefly say a couple things about the economy work. If we thought it was hard for people to talk about government, talking about the economy is even more challenging. They have lots of opinions about government. They really are intimidated by conversations about the economy, and they defer to experts, whoever this might be. There are some models that are instantly at play with people, and one is a sense of government as the weather. And this dominates discussions about the economy, from the progressive side to the conservative side. From New York Times to the Wall Street Journal, using metaphors and analogies that are weather-related to describe how the economy works, which is deeply problematic, because how do you control the weather? You do not, right? And so if that's the model of how the economy works, then we ride out the storms and we surf the good times. And so it's very hard to get people then engaged in a policy conversation about how you would shape the economy if that's the dominant model that they have. When you push a little deeper, there's another almost equally problematic model, which in the research you'll see if you look at it, called the individual actor model. And that is that the economy is kind of the result of the added up individual decisions of you and I. I got a good education, now I have a good job, I'm able to buy something from you, this kind of transactional, but all connected to a deeply held kind of American morality of reward and punishment, right? So you work hard, you make moral choices, you get lucky, you succeed, and you're economically rewarded. You don't work hard, you're lazy, you make bad moral choices, sometimes you're unlucky, you don't. Oh well, right? And I think that has made it really hard traditionally because of that kind of mythology of economic mobility. To talk about inequality, this is a big crack. One of the few kind of big changes in context, to your question, was a crack in this awareness really after the economic meltdown and the rise of the Occupy movement. A sense that, wait a minute, maybe there's something rigged here, and a fundamental kind of concern that the rules of the game are not actually fair. And so therefore, this kind of mythology of anybody can make it is kind of rattled in a different way. People also in the post kind of recession work we did, much less willing to trust that the magic numbers of how the stock market's doing and GDP were the right way to judge the economy. This deference to experts essentially was also damaged. And I'm much more interested in how do I judge how the economy is doing around me? Does my neighbor have a job? Are they able to send their kids to school? Again, huge openings to engage people in questions like, well, you're right, that's how we should judge the economy. If so, then what are the decision points about that? And that's a very different, opening than, oh well, the economy and some experts know what's going on, and as long as the GDP looks good, we're fine, right? Those are very different kind of background noise, if you will, to the way people think about it. But it's very hard still for people to think about government's role, and there's a whole set of hurdles in the presentations we do, we talk about. In a similar way, we did test whether or not this kind of public structures model was useful, for helping people think about the economy and getting them to think about it being man-made, and essentially that there is a foundation under the economy of public systems and public investments. And that, as I'm not spending time on it today, really was the opening, like to help people remember that a private economy is only as healthy as the public economy that it rests on. And that kind of engaged people in that question was a useful opening. There's a whole set of video clips about that. Just one example, again, from the field, a fair amount of work in Oregon, particularly with the Metro Regional government. Here is a guy who's the head of the Metro Regional Council and a former mayor making the case using exactly the language you'd want him to use. So, in an op-ed that he had. And he actually uses the public structures term in there pretty naturally. Anyway, so just, so people, we are really getting people to really play with this in kind of their public communications. And this guy has he's got a blue pulpit. He's an important regional guy. Almost done with slides. The third problem, and maybe in some ways culturally more challenging one, is this sense of a consumer stance toward government, and kind of government as a vending machine, and this kind of move away from kind of a civic relationship to government to this kind of transactional customer relationship. One of my biggest challenges in the field with a lot of public managers is they've been sold on the treat people as customers story, and accountability and return on investment and run the place like a business. And those, I am pretty deeply convinced, are trapped. They're alleys you can't get out of. Because it's not that we don't want to make an economic case for public investments, but if that's your lead point, then the questions are instantly, I don't get that service, why should I pay for that? Or can we get it cheaper if we privatize it? And now you're in a debate about the money, not in a debate about the purpose, right? And so really, and with advocates even, have been sold, oh, we need to make the economic case for early childhood development. I'm not arguing that that's not an important supportive data, but if it's your primary point, then you are arguing, the argument is whether or not that is the right amount of money, whether it's waste, you're in a box that's really hard to get out of. And so we do a whole set of work on, like, how do you talk about accountability without triggering a consumer mindset? How do you kind of engage in a debate about investment and the kind of those kinds of ideas without, again, fueling a consumer lens, if you will? And we live in a consumer culture. We're sold something every 10 seconds. This is imbued around us, and so it's hard, even with advocates, we live in this kind of world in which the consumer language is dominant, and you have to work against that. The challenge here is, again, to reinvigorate, and I talked about those openings, about people wanting to feel more kind of connected in a kind of civic responsibility way. I think there's really important work here to get people to see that they do have a role to play and they can engage in government more personally. Fundamentally, at almost a philosophical level, reinvigorating notions of interdependence and shared fate, and that's a whole set of work we do, particularly with poverty advocates, is the core of this. Because if people don't see themselves as connected or see themselves as having common purpose and common goals, it's real hard then to make the case for public tools as shared things that we're trying to do stuff together with. So like I said, culturally, this may be the deeper challenge, but it's a really important one. There are some subtle things we try and get people to do, is to use more collective pronouns when they talk about government. I don't want to oversell that, but it's surprising how much even advocates kind of third person their descriptions. Oh, that's the so-and-so county health department, and they kind of talk about it in very bureaucratic terms, and just ownership language. These are our public health agencies, and here's how they serve our community. Just in a subtle but I think not unimportant way, that kind of language helps it see this as things we own, and that we operate versus government's over there and we're over here, and here's the kind of interaction that we have. So that's another set of work we do in the field. So 3 kind of dominant stories I've talked about, and then the kind of 3 antidotes that we really just kind of really then have operationalized into these workshops. Okay, then what would it mean to constantly make sure you're articulating what is the unique purpose of this public program? Are you helping people see the system and how it works and the nuts and bolts of that, and using language that evokes that and makes it more apparent to people? And are you engaging people in this conversation through a kind of a citizen lens? And then the field work is all about trying to get that to be a practical application. I think the only thing I wanted to end with is we've done a fair amount of work on taxes, and I'll leave this set of slides, and there's other versions on our websites. The crucible of a lot of attitudes about government obviously is in the revenue fights, and this is the core finding of our revenue work. Taxes literally has taken money, and so this deep disconnect from taxes from what they pay for is the fundamental challenge, because it is only treated as money I'm losing, right? And the anti-tax movement has really, that's been their primary goal, to treat it only as lost funds and don't have a conversation about what it gets you in the terms of a functioning society. Keep those conversations kind of separate, and so you get this kind of craziness, right? Which, so we have a whole set of work on taxes, which is then trying to use some of these core ideas and the research on taxes to get people to reconnect the dots between taxes and their purposes, to avoid bad terminology like tax burden, tax relief, hard-earned tax dollars. I've even really tried to get advocates to stop using taxpayer, because I think, and that's a shortcut that we just use all the time, but it limits your role to the person who writes the check, right? And I think that why don't you just say the people of the state, or whatever you want to say. I mean, so I stumbled on it by helping a guy write an op-ed, and his last line was like, and if we make these choices, they'll be good for the taxpayers of Washington. Like, isn't it just good for the people of Washington? I mean, but we're in the habit of using that as a shortcut, right, for a citizen, or whatever that means. And I think it just reinforces this consumer model, and that my only relationship is when I write, when I hand over money. So there's a whole set of work on taxes I won't spend time on now, that we've been in a lot of those rooms in the last couple of years, just because that's the reality. How do you try and make a case for revenue in an important way? And I'll end with this. So a few years ago, Massachusetts fought off an attempt to roll back the sales tax. They would have lost quite a bit, millions of dollars. So on the left side, there's the people in favor of that, right? Which wanted to roll it back to 3%, I think. And they trigger every single one of the dominant anti-government, anti-tax things that I've talked about, right? I mean, they fit them all in their 120 words. I mean, they got them all in. And the discipline of the people that we had worked with in Massachusetts, and their own good instincts, was to continue to tell a community story and of values and what's at stake. So they didn't try to refute these things. They start by reminding people what taxes pay for, and it was really, that became their fundamental connection between this decision and the quality of life in your communities. And they did a great work. They busted their butts and had to spend a lot of money, but the initial polling on this was, I think, over 60% in favor, and they turned it by the end to the opposite. Like I said, they did great campaigning and had to spend a lot of money, but they had a very consistent message, which was a community kind of well-being message, and connecting the dots between the loss of this revenue and that, and I think in an important way. And now they're going forward potentially with some new revenue in the coming year. Also, we did a fair amount of work, we can talk about this later, on the Prop 30 campaign here, kind of consulting with and helping different organizations like California Calls and Mobilize the Immigrant Vote, and California Partnership, some trainings with them. But in our mind, and we did a little memo, it's on our website, kind of analyzing the public and media discourse on Prop 30. We did it in October, kind of before the vote, so I'm hoping it would win. But you can take a look at how we interpret kind of tax fights through our lens in that memo. But in our mind, it's a great example of the things we try and get people to do, to focus on the future, to focus on kind of a narrative that includes kind of a quality of life and a really deeply held kind of value in the state. So Reclaim California's Future and the whole kind of California dream narrative that many of the organizers were using, all that stuff is right down the way we'd like people to do it. And the good news is it passed, right? So we're trying to both get people in the audiences we're in to think deeply and philosophically about this and apply it to the tax fight they're in tomorrow, and so.
Well, it's a great way to end with a broadened sense of we. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, it's fun.